The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Over the past 20 years, scientists have made great strides in understanding the brain, and at the same time, they know very little about how it works. Neurobiologist Lu Chen says we know very little about the brain. We know about connections, but we don't know how information is processed. Learning, for example, doesn't just require good memory, it also depends on speed, creativity, attention, focus, and most importantly, flexibility. Understanding exactly how the neural pathways function could lead to improved treatments for depression, genetic disease, and many other conditions. Well, enter renowned SFU neuroscientist Dr. Randy McIntosh, who identified a significant challenge, and that is a need for a virtual brain that will house research from around the world. Dr. McIntosh envisioned and co-created the virtual brain as a platform for use by a wide range of researchers to simulate their work in a complex, interdisciplinary manner that will allow them to see the effects their work have on the brain. Dr. McIntosh says, I have been building the ideas around an inclusive and extended approach to neuroscience that goes outside of traditional boundaries. And I am confident that SFU is the place to make these ideas a reality. I invited Dr. Randy McIntosh to join me for a conversation that matters about the vast new world of brain research that allows scientists to boldly go where no neurologist has gone before. Dr. McIntosh, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Okay, I'm conflicted about where do we start. Do we talk about what we know, or do we just leap into the virtual brain? Because the virtual brain is such a unique and complex idea. Mm-hmm. Do we need to lay the foundation of saying, here's what we know and why we need the virtual brain, or can you just start telling us about the virtual brain?
I can maybe do both of those things. So modern neuroscience has come a long way with technology to be able to take different parts of the brain and pull them apart. So for example, MRI is a good example. It's been used for medical imaging, but it's also now being used for research to look at structure, to look at function, and different aspects of that. And the advantage of that is you can get fine details now in humans, which we couldn't do before, and look at their brains as they're actually thinking in real time. The problem is that you're just getting parts of the picture, and each scan gives you only a snapshot of what's actually happening. And the problem is that you pull this machine apart, but you actually don't know how it works when it's all put back together. And this is the challenge that we run into in modern neuroscience, is that we've got these tools that tell us about the pieces, but they don't tell us how they work together. And that's what led to the idea of the virtual brain, is that my colleague and I were sitting in a pub in Cambridge talking about this challenge and said, what we need is a virtual brain. Oh, the next thing we're writing on a napkin, and bang, now we're building a model that actually takes these data and puts them together to understand how does these pieces work together to support healthy function. But also can we understand then what happens if certain parts are damaged or deteriorating in the case of a clinical dysfunction. And that's sort of the idea behind the virtual brain, is that you can use a person's data to create a model of their brain and look at how it's functioning and then test interventions in this virtual platform.
As you're explaining that, I start thinking about what the magnitude of that challenge must be. Because if all you're taking are just little thin slices of what we actually understand now. Yeah. Of course, we know all the different parts of the brain, but if you're taking thin slices of things that work, how do you even know how they're going to interact with other thin slices?
Great question, and this is part of the challenge for the task. We've been doing this now for about 20 years, I guess, and every time we add a new piece of information, you get more complexity to the whole situation. And it's trying to find a balance between creating a model that tells you something versus a model that tries to tell you everything. And the second scenario where it tries to tell you everything is a model you can never build.
Right.
That's really building a real brain then. So what we want is a model that tells us something that will help us either understand some basic property of the brain or help us understand something that's fundamental to clinical interventions. And right now, we're pretty close to being able to do that. For example, my colleague in France, we're using the virtual brain now as part of a clinical trial for epilepsy surgery intervention. The model there does not have all the details that you need. It doesn't go down to molecules, but it gives you enough information to guide the clinician when they're going to intervene surgically in that person, and that's actually a pretty good model for the brain.
So, like, how precise then is it for that clinician then to be able to be looking at the patient that they're dealing with,
Yeah.
to be able to refer to the virtual brain and say, here's where I go?
Well, I mean, we're still waiting for the outcome of the clinical trial, but right
Okay.
now it looks like it's doing a pretty good job. It's telling you, first of all, where should you intervene, but more importantly, where should you not intervene as well? Because you don't want to have a situation where you take away too much, because it is, it's an invasive procedure, and it's going to affect function. So you want to sort of balance between, curing the epilepsy, but also making sure they have maintained function. And so far, it looks like it's actually working pretty good. It's not the level of molecules, it's actually the level of sort of little pieces of tissue in the brain. But that's sort of the level of the intervention right now.
Well, that we are down to that point. I remember reading an article going back to the 1880s or so when there were German scientists who first had an opportunity to start to probe the brain of a living patient. And they would probe and go, oh, that's that finger and there's this twitch and whatnot. And ultimately they went, we've gone as far as we can.
Yeah.
And we think that we'd be lucky if we understand 10% of what the makeup of the brain is. Do we at least understand the full structure of the brain?
Wow, no, I would say not. The challenge with the brain is that it operates at many different levels. And this is one of the things that's hard to appreciate when we talk about understanding the brain, is that there's sort of this bias amongst each neuroscience think that my level is the best level to look at, when in fact they all work together. So you have really, long-range connections that you see on an MRI, but you've got micro connections that happen as well. And that interplay between different scales is really what makes the brain work the way it does, but also what makes it a very difficult organ to assess. Because we don't really know how these different structural levels work together in supporting the conversation that you and I are having, for example. We have some ideas, and that's what's leading towards this interplay of the modeling and the empirical investigations. But I don't think we're even close right now to understanding the structure.
So then how do you then start to build a simulation of that you hope through, really has to be trial and error, will bring you to a closer appreciation of what those elements are or functions that are happening in the brain?
Yeah, I mean, modeling is a way of telling you of a collection of guesses that I have about how the system works. Here are the guesses that probably are most consistent with what I see in the data, and here are the guesses that are not. So it's not so much that you're going to find a model that is the true model. You're going to find a model that constrains that truth, if you will. And the model is a continued evolution. So as we gain more knowledge, as we test more scenarios, we get closer and closer to, I wouldn't say reality, but at least eliminating things that are unlikely to happen.
So it's a process of, it's reductive.
In a sense, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody who's going to be watching this can't help but say, okay, probably one of the most pressing issues for anybody who's aging is dementia or ultimately Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
How is this going to help us address that? What I think is a very important issue, because the lifespans around the world are continuing to grow or expand out.
That's a big question. That's part of the reason that I started with virtual brain. It's part of the reason I came to SFU, is I wanted to try and work with the different groups that are addressing this issue. There's a thing in SFU called the Big Data Hub, for instance, and their mandate is to support this evolution in science where we're talking about now big data. And so we can collect tons of data now, but it's not really useful until we can actually put it together. So what the modeling can do for us is start pulling these different data sets together and saying, if I take a model that's a 25-year-old adult, say, female living in downtown Vancouver, and you have her life history, can I predict how she's going to move forward in life?
I don't think so.
Right now, no. But we can start creating models that take steps along the way and say, here are the paths that are consistent with healthy brain aging. Here are the paths that are consistent with unhealthy aging. And what are the factors that determine that? So it's kind of like building a model to tell you, what is my trajectory? trajectory for healthy aging, trajectory for risk of dementia. And if I find out where those trajectories are going, can I then intervene and at least either prevent it from happening or at least alleviate it so that when someone gets to that point, they're able to deal with it so it doesn't affect their quality of life. That's kind of where we're at now, is trying to use the massive amounts of data that have been collected in neuroscience, putting it together in a simulation that allows us to look at lifespan trajectories, and then say, now if I have somebody coming into my clinic, or even somebody from the street, for example, who has enough data that we can put it in there and say, here's the predicted trajectory. Again, it's a model, it's not perfect, right? But at least it eliminates some scenarios and helps us better understand the potential for where they're going to go.
So when you created the virtual brain, the objective was to make it a center for research and or to further research, to be able to see this interplay between what you're doing and what we know about the brain. Is that still its role, purely as a research, virtual brain, or is it also, as you said, there's a clinical trial, but that's still trials. That's not getting to the clinicians that, as a rule, are interacting with patients. How far away are we from being able to see direct clinician to patient interactions that will benefit from the virtual brain?
Sure. I mean, the trial in France, that answer depends a lot on what the outcome of that trial is. Let's assume it's going to be successful. That would mean then that when a patient comes into a hospital in France, they would be able to get, if they have epilepsy that can't be treated by drugs, they would get an assessment done, they would get a chart based on their data, and that chart would be given to the clinician, and that help them make a decision in terms of how to treat them. So in that case, it's actually usable, within say 5 years. The dementia protocol depends a lot on again how these data come together and what they look like. It's probably more than like a 10 years down the road thing. The other aspect, I think, is using the virtual brain as an interface to some wearable devices as well. And those are probably within 5 to 10 years as well. Again, it's just a question of getting the right interactions with the engineers, with the other computer scientists, and then getting people to work with us in helping us to collect the right data so that when we make these devices, we're giving people information that they can use.
So, of course, that's a big part of this is going to help researchers understand how to address malfunctioning in the brain. But how do we optimize the function of the brain? Will the virtual brain help us to have or potentially reach our own maximum potential? Because this is something that I would really like to see.
Yeah.
Because I got a long way to go.
Yeah. I mean, we all would love that. Let me answer from a different perspective. One of the challenges in neuroscience is that a lot of us who are studying the brain, and this is, it's a fault of mine as well, tend to forget that the brain doesn't function in isolation. We're sitting here now, we don't see my brain, you see my whole body, right? So brain health and maintaining brain health and optimizing brain health is as much about your environment as it is about your brain. And that's a really difficult thing to, first of all, internalize. It's even more difficult to study, because you can imagine if we try to take into consideration all the factors that can affect this thing in my head. We're going from when and where I was born to, is this actually good water or bad water? And all these things are going to interact to affect my brain health. There's no real platform to understand that. But if we start appreciating that, we can at least make inroads to saying that, let me look at somebody in their environment. Let me look at somebody who lives in downtown Vancouver. What is their lifestyle? What does their brain look like now? What is their family history? Put that all together in a much more comprehensive model of their existence. And you put that into a broader sort of social cultural context. Then you can see how that thing, which was this little virtual brain that we had built 10 years ago, now becomes a social brain, becomes a cultural brain, becomes a platform that allows us to understand much more about what it is to be human and optimize being human than just optimizing our brains per se. And it's a much bigger impact than in my mind. And that's what we're trying to do with this institute, SFU.
Okay, maybe I was asking too grand of a question in some ways, saying I want it all. But will this also help us to understand how we learn and how we can be better learners? Because I think that this will also unlock potential to answer some of the other mysteries of the brain.
Yeah, that's definitely in the work plan now, with work that we're starting at SFU, work that's going on in Germany, is to understand how, I'm going to use a really simple term, how the brain rewires itself to learn.
Which we know it does.
Yes.
That part we do know.
Yeah, and then it's a question of, what makes that rewiring possible. One of the other challenges, of course, is if you rewire the brain, how do I maintain what I already have? So there's this balance between what's there now and what we have to learn to go on top of that. These are questions that have been around for many decades in neuroscience. I think having the platform like the virtual brain allows us to understand that, because we can impart the sort of individuality in there and say, I can put your brain in there and put my brain in there and say, if we're going to learn the same task, what are the predictors that make sure that we both learn it equivalently? If we don't learn it equivalently, why is that? Is there something about sort of how your brain assimilates the new information versus mine, or is there something else that's going on? And these are fundamental questions that I don't think were answerable, say, 20 years ago, but they are answerable now.
And the virtual brain is playing a role in this.
Correct.
Okay, so in my intro, I said that you said that SFU is the place for us to do this. Why? What is it about the community that is being built around neuroscience and big data at SFU that makes this the ideal location for us to be developing what will become an important resource globally?
Yes. So when I got the invitation to come out here and meet the people, the first thing that struck me was that it's not a small university. I mean, it considers itself small by some scale, but it's not really that small. I mean, you've got 3 campuses. There's a good number of people on the campus, right? But it still feels like it's small. It still feels like this is our thing. This is our community. We're part of that community. We are your next door neighbor. You can come and ask us for a cup of sugar if you want. It's that level of sort of community engagement. That's really important, because what that does is it helps to build trust amongst the people that are in the SFU group, if you will. But it also maybe breaks down that sort of ivory tower mentality that's really been a barrier for science, for academic communities, that we want the people that are a part of the community to work with us. We want them to tell us what's important to them. And I get that impression that that's really at the heart and soul of SFU. That's different than other universities I've been at. And that's what really brought me here.
So that was the catalyst to bring you here. But then there is the resources that you require, and then to be able to also attract interest from so many other researchers. What is it, once again, about UBC that makes this an ideal location?
But SFU.
Or, yeah, SFU.
Well, let me just
say, what? Yeah, there's my brain malfunctioning right there.
There are resources at SFU that are quite phenomenal. As a matter of fact, one of the things that really impressed me was their role in sort of the national high-performance computing systems. And I didn't even know this until maybe 3 or 4 months ago, that the system that we were using in Toronto for all the number crunching in virtual brain was actually in SFU.
What?
Yeah, so it's like, that was one of the best computers in Canada for this kind of analysis. This is fantastic. If it's here, why am I not there? And that was, a wise investment to build an infrastructure that could really sort of push things, could push questions in physics, could push questions in biology, and now in neuroscience as well, and even beyond that. So there is that notion that we need good technology to push the envelope. We need smart people to tell us how to deal with big data. It's the big data hub. We need good collaborations with the community in the innovation community to make sure that actually happens. And you've got linkages now that are quite facile in building that. So it has all the pieces in place, and the people that work here are dedicated to making sure that it works. They love coming into work. Everybody, as far as I can tell, even on a Saturday for sometimes. And that's really good. I mean, but they know how to balance things too. And I found that really sort of attractive because that means you're probably going to be more successful ultimately.
Well, how important is SFU's reputation as well in being able to attract other researchers from different jurisdictions around the world to say, yeah, I want to work with you?
It's good. It's not great, and I'm saying that honestly because we have there's another university here that's
yeah, I know. Larger. I mistakenly just mentioned it.
So it's a challenge, right?
Right.
And I think what I want to try and avoid at SFU is building some antagonism, because we're a small country. We have a lot of really smart people that can work together on this platform. We got a lot of smart people in Western Canada that can work on this platform. Instead of trying to say who's best, let's just do something good and work together in doing that. And I've been here for a little bit more than 4 months, and I've already had conversations with people at UBC to build something new, to build something that is good, and they're enthusiastic about it. They want to come. We had a meeting at BC Children's this last week where we brought us, a collection of scientists together from various levels of seniority and so on, very enthusiastic, from BC Children's, from UBC, from SFU. Let's do something different. Let's do something new. And that's the kind of energy that I want to make sure that we maintain and use then to push this whole agenda forward.
So what does that say about the scientific and research community that we're building here in British Columbia?
It's doing science differently. It's doing science both with the intention of discovering, which is the core purpose for science, but it's also doing science with the intention of making sure that science has impact. And it's not necessarily the responsibility for every person doing the science to make sure that there's impact, but it is a possibility for people who span the different levels of science to work together to understand what that looks like and talk to one another to make sure that happens. So, my job as the director of the Institute is to pull these people together. I'm sort of like the hub, if you will, or the linchpin, so that people who are doing engineering, theoretical physicists who don't really care if it's used in the clinic, they want to understand the math, but they can talk to a clinician, and they will learn to understand one another. It takes some time, of course, but once they do, all of a sudden you have a dialogue that's happening, and you can accelerate the translation of really core science to application that makes differences to our lives.
Okay, here's maybe an impossible question to answer, but will the virtual brain help us understand what it means to be human?
Oh, good question. Some of that's philosophical, and I'm considered senior now in the field, and one of the things that happens, of course, with the senior members of a science community is they start waxing eloquently about things like consciousness, like existence, and so on. I don't think I'm going to see that before I retire. I think it'll get us closer. And it's not so much that the virtual brain in itself is going to help us do that, but it's actually what we do with that virtual brain, that we start understanding more about our brains. And by doing that, we understand more about ourselves, and that's actually getting us close to understanding what it is to be human.
I'm hoping that at some point, and I'm sure it's not going to happen in our lifetime, that there will be virtual brains that you say, okay, this body is letting me down now, I'm going in there. Just plug me in. It's absolutely fascinating, and I'm so happy that it's happening here in Vancouver, because I'm such a proud supporter of what we're doing scientifically in British Columbia, and I want everybody to appreciate the extraordinary work that you're doing and so many other scientists and researchers in BC. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Yeah.